I hate my mother. Those are strong words that are forbidden and shunned by God. And I struggle with this emotion every day of my life. But it's how I feel. As a child, I would see other children long for their mothers, cling to their mothers, cry for their mothers. I was glad when my mother was away. I hated to be near mine. I hated to hear her voice. Damn, even her voice, And I would feel nauseous, anticipating her return home from work. I cringed when she was in the same room with me and looked forward to bedtime because that meant, at least for the day, my time with her was over. I was fully aware of these feelings as early as 3 years old. It seems almost unnatural for a child to despise the woman who gave him or her life. But my life was different. I knew I wasn't like other children. My mother is beautiful. She is a one-woman melting pot of Puerto Rican, Jamaican, and Danish heritage. I remember her skin being slightly tanned and her hair thick and wavy. She walked with a switch and a sway, and everywhere she went, men followed. You see, the apple is not falling far from the tree. She bathed herself in perfume and wore tight-fitting clothes. She adorned herself with 24-karat gold. She was never without a man, somebody's man. But even with all the beauty and charm, there was another side to Josephine. She was a very unhappy woman who didn't have any female friends. She based her whole existence on the ability to get a man. That's sad. And she always seemed unhappy because one of these men who she desperately needed in her life had done her wrong. There was a revolving door of men when I was growing up. Some of them even came back for seconds and thirds, but none of them ever stayed. I knew she loved my father and wanted to be with him, but he too didn't stay. His time with her seemed to be just that, time, and time changes things. I witnessed my mother running around town aimlessly. I would hear the women around town talk about her. It usually followed a complimentary comment about me. Karine, she's so smart, She's the only one to score 100 on her test last week. But that mother of hers, I heard she was seen with so-and-so's husband. Eventually, my two sisters came along, born only a year and a half apart. We were all bastards. Each of us the product of different men. Men who would never stay, men who would never come back, men who I was forced to call uncle, something for which I resented my mother. I never really knew the two men who fathered my sisters. To tell the truth, I don't believe my mother knew them very well either. She seemed to be in a vicious cycle of trying to keep men in her life by having their babies. Girl, that don't work. After the third child, perhaps, she began to get the hint. Damn, how many kids she have? No judgment, but damn. I remember vividly one night I woke up and was startled to realise that I had been moved from the bed and crammed into the crib with my infant sister. My mother was 5 months pregnant with my youngest sister. I immediately figured that my mum needed the bed. There was a back door in our room that led to the backyard. It was perfect for my mother, who had been sneaking men in and out of this door nearly her entire life. I couldn't make out what was being said, but the tone of the whispers was heavy. Just as my vision had thoroughly adjusted, I realised the man standing in the hallway must have been the father of the baby she was carrying. I blinked a few times, wanting to get a better look, and tried to make out what was being said. My mother was begging, "No, don't go." We were in competition from the day I arrived. My purpose in life was supposed to keep my father with her, to make him love her. But a one-night stand is just that, no matter how long it lasts. The mistake he made wasn't leaving her, but leaving me with her. I was born in 1978 on a hot, sticky, late August day in the 28 square mile island of St. Thomas. My mother was an 18-year-old native. My father was 26. And lived on the island from 1976 to 1984. After my father went back to his life on Long Island, New York, my mother and I lived with my grandmother Vivian in her 4-bedroom house. Along with me, my mother and grandmother were also my aunt, 2 cousins, and 2 uncles. Damn, girl. Damn. Later came my 2 younger sisters. In all, there was 10 of us sharing 4 bedrooms. The house had 1 bathroom, gross, uncovered windows, no hot water, no washing machines, and no air conditioning. In the ghetto. On most days, we had to boil water for our baths. On those days, my 2 cousins and I shared the same bath water. The rule is the youngest bath first, which was one of the few times that being the youngest paid off for me. But sometimes there was no time to boil water, and that's when we took cold showers, and we took them very quickly. My grandmother would wash all the clothes by hand, everything. Towels and sheets, jeans and shirts, everyone was supposed to wash their own clothes, but my grandmother would often be seen outside with 2 large barrels washing everyone's clothes. They would be hung out to dry on the wire lines that she tied between 2 poles in the backyard. The bathroom was small and run down, as was most of the house. The water supply was prepaid and delivered to the house by a water truck, which funneled the water into a cistern below the house. Because of this, we weren't allowed to use much water, so we kept empty buckets outside to save rainwater. We even saved bath water in order to flush the toilet. My grandma saw no sense in flushing the clean water that could be used for drinking. That's true, Grandma. That's very true. Come winter, spring, or fall, sunshine or hurricane, the windows to our house always seemed to be open. That's like my house. They were actually louvers, metal shutters with a turning handle, which would open them. There was no glass or screens to protect the house from insects or even large animals. It was not unusual to come home to a bat or a tarantula, a stray cat, dog, or chicken in the house. You know you made soup. You know you made the chicken soup. It was common to just chase them into the backyard or the pot. The backyard was like another world, filled with fruit trees like banana, papaya, guava, avocado, and passion fruit. Stray animals lived back there, surrounded by a plethora of herbs that my grandmother would boil down to make home remedies for any and all ailments. I love this. This was the way of life there. It was normal. It was normal for my grandmother to take care of us all. My mother would stay out all night, sometimes not returning for days at a time, but my grandmother Vivian was always there. I called her Ma. She encouraged me and she supported me. I love that. I was a smart kid, well known for my academic achievements. I was always featured in school plays and showcases. When the Stoufers, corporation built a resort on the island's waterfront in 1983, I was invited to recite poems I had written and to cut the ribbon at the opening ceremony. My grandmother was there, my mother was not. My mother never came to any of my events. It was my grandmother who always made sure every time I performed I had a shiny, new patent leather shoes and a brand new dress. She was adamant that no one ever saw me in the same dress twice. I like that, Grandma. My grandmother was strict, but it was evident she loved me. The relationship between my grandmother and my mother was quite a different story. There was something there, and I never was sure what it was. My grandmother Vivian had 7 children, some from different fathers. My mother was the youngest and the sibling with the fairest complexion, something that was obviously an issue amongst the sisters. I believe that my mother's father Axel was the only man who married my grandmother, and my mother played that card as often as possible. In her mind, being light-skinned and the only non-bastard of the 7 made her superior to the others. If my grandmother did show any favour at all, it may have been only because my mother was the baby, the last born of her 7 children. It is my belief that it was the favour my mother was shown outside of the house which made her feel superior, and in turn my aunts resented her. By the time I was born, the damage between my aunts and my mother had been done. Even as a young child, I could feel the tension. To this day, none of my aunts speaks to my mother. As I got older, it seemed like my relationship with my mother grew more and more contentious. She became more impatient and more brutal towards me. One day after school, right after my first sister was born, I went to meet my mother at her job at a little clothing store called Marianne's. As I was leaving to walk home, I noticed a woman in a car parked outside next to the sidewalk. She called me over and asked if my mother had a baby boy or girl. Being 7, I answered the question truthfully, a girl, and continued on my way home. Not even 30 minutes after I got in the house, my mother came barreling through the door. A sinking feeling came over me. Automatically, I knew I was in trouble. I wasn't sure what I'd done, but I knew for sure I was in trouble. Yeah, I know that feeling. I know that feeling. "You're not supposed to tell my business out in the street," my mother yelled at me. "I don't care who asks you. You keep your mouth shut." No one was home. I prayed silently that my grandmother would make it to the door before the first blow of the belt. My mother walked away and came back with a Webster's World Edition dictionary. Damn, a dictionary, you know. It was the biggest book I had ever seen as a child. It contained every single word in the English language and many from other parts of the world, including slang. This book must have weighed more than 10 pounds. And as she picked it up, I just knew she was going to swing it across my head. I closed my eyes and kept praying for my grandmother to make it home from work. As I prayed, my mother was still going on about what I had done wrong. It was all too grown up for me to really understand. I didn't know the rules of engagement between adults. At 7 years old, I had no idea what business was and why other women were in hers. And for this, I was about to get pummeled by the Websters. Damn. I felt this heavy weight on top of my head and opened my eyes to see that my mother had placed a dictionary on my head. "Get on your knees and balance this until I come back," she barked. "And you better not move or take this book from your head." And then she was gone. I figured she'd left to undo any damage I'd done by telling her business. So I knelt there, still praying. My young rational mind told me to get up from that spot and relax my aching back and knees. And if she did make it back, I had enough time to put the dictionary back on my head and get back into position before she hit the door. It was a brilliant plan, and I could most certainly have worked, but my frightened true self had serious doubts. What if I don't make it back into position in time? I asked myself. She'll tear me into shreds and no one will be here to save me. This was the least violent punishment I had ever received, and I was not going to mess it up. This was a good thing, I told myself. I stayed there on my knees with that book on my head, crying and praying for 2 hours. I was weak. My neck and back and knees felt like they were breaking with each passing minute. And just as I ran out of tears, my grandmother came through the door to see me there in the kitchen, struggling to maintain my punishment. "What the hell?" she screamed in anguish. I immediately began to ramble off the events which led to this scene. As I relived the moments, the tears began to stream again. The look in my grandma's eye was so painful. She didn't understand the story and how I could be punished for answering a question. Honestly, for essentially being a child. The hurt in her eyes made me hurt more, and I began to cry less for myself and more for her. It wouldn't be the last time she'd be there to rescue me. My mother had been a seamstress. I loved making clothes for my dolls out of her leftover scraps of material. One day, though, I had a better idea. In my drawer was a sock without a mate, white with lacy ruffle around their edge. My creative brain went to work as I cut the toe from the sock and made a pair of straps, creating a frilly ball gown for my doll. Somewhere in the middle of all this excitement, I lost my mother's shears. I hadn't noticed until she came home from work and started looking for them. She finally asked me, "Have you seen my scissors? They're not in my sewing box where I left them." By the look of sheer terror in my eyes, she could tell that I had done something wrong, so I confessed to making the sock dress. She looked high and I looked low. The scissors were lost and I couldn't breathe or swallow because my next move could be the end. Just as I was about to give up, I spotted them behind the bed. Why hadn't I seen them before? Just as I began to feel relieved that the scissors had been found, I was attacked from behind with a 6-inch wide leather belt. My mother beat me and beat me until my body was on fire. Every lash felt like 1,000. She beat me, she spewed obscenities and told me how stupid I was. The lashes got more and more severe until the welts opened up and began to ooze blood. Oh my God. Who does that to someone, let alone your child? Like, this is fucked. She had stripped me naked and beaten me until my body lay swollen and bloody, naked, you know. Nah. I was fading in and out of consciousness. The next thing I remember is my grandma bursting through the bedroom door, grabbing me by the wrist, throwing me into the shower and running cold water over my blistering skin. Shit. Any other day, I dreaded a cold shower, but on that day, I revelled in it. It felt as if that cold water brought me back to life, because it probably did. As I stood there in the tub catching my breath, I could hear my grandmother and my mother fighting. My grandmother Vivian was my guardian angel. My mother, to me, was the devil. And while the battle of good and evil played out in the next room, I was in my own personal purgatory in the bathroom. Soon enough, my purgatory would turn into a living hell. The four of us being crammed into that one room must have taken its toll on my mother. It also seemed that my mother had finally had enough of living on a small island where everyone knew her business. When I was 10 years old, we packed up and moved to Florida. We arrived during one of the state's coldest winters, which seemed fitting. I didn't appreciate the change in venue because it took me away from the one person who was always in my corner, my grandmother. I was in the 5th grade and became a social outcast. I wasn't as pretty as the other girls in my school. How old is the 5th grade? Because, I don't know, I'm in the UK. I had an accent from my years on the island, and I wasn't an academic standout I had been in St. Thomas. This was a much bigger playing field. I was lost and my mother didn't help. I remember my 5th grade banquet at the end of the school year, and I had gone through the entire semester looking and feeling like a misfit. My clothes were never up to date, and I wore the same things over and over. There was no hope. Oh, there was hope for me to redeem myself at the banquet because my mother would be making my dress. When she arrived home with a few yards of peach satin material, I was pleased. I could see myself in a beautiful feminine peach gown that everyone would adore and envy. As my mother went to work on my dress, I waited and watched. I knew I couldn't tell anybody that my mother was making my dress. So when I was asked about it, I said she had bought a beautiful peach dress from the mall and that it was very expensive. 3 days after my mother started the dress, it was finished. I raced home to see the finished product. There it was hanging on the closet door in my room. It was peach, it was frilly, it was horrible. It looked like a big satin box with sleeves and ruffles. I was mortified. Holding back the tears of disappointment, I tried the dress on and as instructed. It fell over my tiny frame like a brown paper bag. I arrived at the schoolyard for the banquet with this peach drape hanging from my bony shoulders. I heard the laughter, but I pretended I didn't. I felt small as I looked around the room at everyone else's dress. I wished I was invisible. As the day went on, I grew increasingly self-conscious and watched the clock, constantly waiting for the banquet to end. Finally, when my mother picked me up that afternoon, she spoke the words which would stay with me forever. Upon seeing all the other girls' dresses, she said, "See, That's why I made you a dress. I don't want nobody looking at you. Peek. Now that we are far away from the island, where I had family and friends who loved and supported me, she could make me look and feel so small no one would ever notice me, and she did. However, by the end of my 5th grade year, someone did notice me. His name was Kevin. I don't remember much about him, except he had blonde hair and blue eyes, and I thought he was the cutest boy in my class. After school, I invited him and another boy, as well as one of my best friends, back with me to my house. There were only about 2 hours between the time I got home from school and the time my mother returned home from work, but I began to find ways to maximise that little block of time. On one afternoon, Kevin gave me my first real kiss. I was 10, and a lot of things inside me would be different from that point on. I would crave the feeling I had the day when he kissed me. I felt loved, I felt pretty, I was acknowledged, and I wanted